Okay, just to start with a disclaimer, the two of them are going to be coughing quite a lot, but it's not COVID. It's just allergies and a change of the weather, a turn of the weather, sort of flu. So yeah, no worries about that. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming and for being here. Thank you, Shri, for the introduction. Yeah, so as you guys have seen, Sandeep and Rohini's works are in quite generative conversation with one another, but I think they are also very specific processes. So maybe we want to start by asking each of them to sort of describe the specificities and the particularities of these works, in reference to medium, as well as the technicalities of it. So yeah, do you guys want to go?
You want me to start? Sure. The pink work, can you hear me? The pink work was made in 2002. At that point, I was using my body as a found object, as a ready-made that was available to me. I had looked at culture outside of me to make imagery for a long time, and then decided to go back to me, my body, my corporeal self that I carried with me everywhere. I was also interested in combining painting, drawing, and sculpture in one place. So in the pink piece, you'll see that the paint's on the back side, the drawing is on the front, and the embossing is on both sides. So it was for me to create these hybrid objects at that time in 2002. I was really interested. I was also interested in music and repetition and what that did to space, both internal space and external space. So that piece was based on two songs, one by Macy Gray, I Try, and one on Daft Punk, One More Time. The Daft Punk song, the words were really upbeat, but the melody was really melancholic, and vice versa for the Macy Gray. So that was another paradox that was really kind of grasped at me, and I wanted to just go into that repeat space, and that's what generated that body of work. They're on duraline, which is like a mylar. So you can erase pigment, you can erase pencil, paint, but the embossed lines, which are basically made with knitting needles, are permanent. So memory operates very differently depending on how you make the mark. And again, that panel was the exact length of the wall in the gallery. It's a 5-part panel piece, 25 feet. So each wall was a different verse of the songs. The other one is also made specifically to the length of the gallery, which was 25 feet exactly. There were steps that were taking you up to the space, so you could actually get a flat view, and then you could get a side topographical view as you went up the space. Again, I thought of one gesture, which is dropping a piece of paint in a surface, in a space, and watching it expand out. So every panel, the paint basically expanded out completely to cover the entire panel. And then I came back in with a cleaning product, like a Windex household cleaning product, and I removed parts of the paint away. So it was almost like the tide and ebb, things coming, the centrifugal and centripetal forces that just kept moving back and forth without any center. Again, the embossing was the needle drawing on both sides. And the dots that you see are basically alcohol dropped with a Q-tip. So I was really also interested in using the very prosaic and mundane materials, thinking of painting as a physics set, as a chemistry set, because my background is in sciences as well. Okay.
Yeah. So this piece is Glasshouse Deep. This was made in 2001 and it is 2021, and it's one in a series of works of mine which employ video feedback. And for those of you who don't know, video feedback is a really interesting process which is very similar to acoustic feedback. So basically the same thing that happens when you put a microphone near a speaker, you get a reverb sound. If you take a camera, any regular handheld camera, and you plug it into a TV and you make the camera point at its own reflection on the TV, then a loop of information is created between the two machines, right? So the camera is looking at itself. So what happens, it's like when you put two mirrors in front of each other, an infinite number of reflections. So what happens is that with patience, trial and error, and with a little bit of control, saturation, all those kinds of controls on your analog machine, you can really control the kind of behavior that is generated. So what you see here is not what happens in video feedback, but video feedback will allow you to generate behavior that mimics biological patterns. So you can create things like fractals, like snowflakes, like, amazing forms and shapes that mimic the kind of behavior, self-organization of pattern in nature. So what I do is, again, actually don't look at the screen right now because that is not what video feedback looks like. Video feedback would be, let me give you an example. If you've ever seen like just a starburst, or you just see a point of light, when you turn the camera, a circle will become a square, will become a diamond, will become a pentagon. So it's a really interesting way to think about morphology. If you add mirrors at right angles to the TV, right? So you have a TV, I'm pointing a camera at it. If I add a mirror here and a mirror here, then what I'm basically doing is I'm creating more surfaces for the light to bounce off. So I'm basically creating it in IFS. In mathematics, it's an iterated function system, which is a way to create self-similar fractals. So then you start to see octopus arms, tree structures, etc. So what I do is I shoot a lot of this footage. I then chop it up, and then I stitch it back together again into forms that look like this. But that's just one layer of it. Underneath the layer of video feedback are images that were collected from the Korean Institute of Marine Biology in Korea, which was actually part of the Busan Sea Art Festival curated by Ritika in 2021. And there were these two wonderful scientists, Minji Lee and Sunjun Park, and they had collected diatom samples in the South Korean Sea. So the base of these is images. On top of that is layers of video feedback, often in many, many, many layers. And then those are put through a timeline and then rendered as this. So what you're looking at is potentially, I don't know, like I forget now, like 50 layers of video that are then rendered in a single timeline. So that's the basic, that's the process that goes into video feedback. And I think we can talk more about the sound and the other things after that. And any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's just, there's so much to mine there. Just even in the simple fact of the way that your processes are playing with and morphing and transmuting patterns and playing with the boundaries of what it means to make something visible or invisible or possible, in fact. The thresholds of possibility itself, thresholds of the sensible, as we might have talked about. But I think I kind of want to start at a place where, for the first time, all three of ourselves are in this space, right? In this gallery together. So what, in this current moment, is maybe emerging for you as points of convergence or resonance across the works within this space and the text and so on? Yeah, I'm curious about that.
I think for me, at some level, we are both, I think, if I'm not being too presumptuous, trying to render the invisible, things that you cannot see. Vision, what one can see and what one cannot see. Blindness have been very important to my practice. And for me, abstraction has become a way or a verb to pull away so you can see from a different point, from a different vantage. So it's always this action or this verb that takes me to different places. And it's trying to, again, like I said, render the invisible. And Ro is doing it in this super interesting way, technologically, through film, through moving image, and I'm doing it in my own way.
So actually, this is going to bring me back to something I read in your text. But just as a preface to that, one of the interesting things about video feedback, which I think is similar to what Sandeep is doing, is that the kind of behavior it generates sort of confounds narrative a little bit. It also confounds the ways in which we expect to see narrative unfold, or the way we expect to see. So I've made such good notes, so I'm just going to use them because it's so much better. It's also references. References you associate with cinema or with other moving image, because the behavior in a lot of the work I found in video feedback leads the way. So the material tells you what to do, which I think is very, very similar to what happens with you. And the thing that occurs to me is that there is this lovely section in the text which I highly recommend everybody picks up. It's at the back over there that Ritika has written. It's a lovely, weird, fabulous piece of text, weird in the best way. But there's something lovely you talk about there, where you talk about abstract painting and experimental media have long been viewed as texts that must be read, right, and deciphered by the audience. But you also mention how hauntological cultural theory, this idea of reading the phantom, so the spectator's reading meaning into it. But this makes me think about this lovely text, Post-Humanism by Carrie Wolf, right? Now, please excuse me, this is also the cough syrup that is muddling my brain. So I will read his quote because it's much better written. But he talks about something really wonderful. Brian Eno also experimented with video feedback. And when he writes about that, there's something wonderful that I think references both of what we're talking about. So he says, what undoes the calculated formatting of narrative and time is the interplay of form, the cultural expectations elicited and reproduced by it, with the real magnitudes of analog media. It demands for its effects on the specific embodied positionality and movement of its components. For example, the proximity of the video screen to the television screen on which it creates feedback and distortion. This means that the analog is spooky or spectral for the regime of rendering because, among other things, it depends on the interplay of material forces and bodies, even things like the weather, which I just think is so interesting because video feedback is a deeply embodied process. If I don't move the camera and I don't do stuff, nothing is going to happen. And this is not to laud or to sort of put the analog above the digital, but it's just a very specific way of reading media, which I think is common to both our practices.
Yeah, like seeing something is an active act, it's not passive. You are moving through space and time to actually have this experience of looking at it. One more thing I'll add to that, since I'm a Indian American artist, born in India, grew up for 21 years and moved to the United States. In a Western cultural context, pattern tends to be dismissed as decorative. And for me, pattern is conceptually the structure of where I begin. So I'm very determined and insistent that this is not some pretty thing you put on top of a box to make it look good. It's actually the pattern that makes us see things. It's the things that hide things from us. It's the things that conflate, that intersect. And so pattern actually is a very intellectually rigorous way to approach work. And so to me, oh, it's very decorative. That like gives me a rash.
I know, and but it's exactly those kind of borders and boundaries between these different sort of like lexical categories almost that we're trying to like break down, right? It's also the ways in which the spectralities of those boundaries that reside within those boundaries of things we would prefer to segregate, not we, well, some people would prefer to segregate between the decorative and the high art, right? The conceptual, the abstracted, different forms of analog and digital, like all of these different processes that we're also contending with, across these works. But I guess I also want to come back to something you said, Ro, about the apparition of that the text that you were reading from was talking about between the actors of the actual embodied physical forms that you're playing with and the process of manipulating them in some sense, right? Because for me, that also plays into the audience very much so. When you are a body sort of moving in front of even Ro's projection over here, or you are a body moving in front of Sandeep's work, there is an apparition that is being conjured. You are part of this entire theater that is being cultivated and created within that space, however transient it is, right? So for me, that is always also part of that conversation, that distance making or the conjuring, the seance of sorts that we're kind of creating here, right? But yeah, just wanted to kind of bring it back to the spectrality of it all,
and
I guess.
And to add to that, the notion of color, which is so destabilizing because it escapes semantic content. And to think of color not as symbolically, but as relationally. To me, that's been very important because I get this, oh, your colors are so Indian.
Really?
Indian.
Oh,
What?
please.
They're so Indian?
Oh, oranges and reds.
What?
Listen to me, this is real. This is real. So I have to say, like, what do you mean by that? I had an office where the floor had made it red, and the professor walked in. Is this an Indian cultural thing that you have red floors? I'm like, no. So you know what I'm saying? It's that sort of taking that idea of fixity and then flipping it over and saying, no, color is actually an intensive property. It's not extensive. So don't try to extend it and measure it.
It's so interesting because I used to use, when I first shot video feedback, the first time I experimented with it was in 2006. And then I had a cathode ray TV, the ones with the big backs. So if you shoot video feedback on them, it's bright color saturation and blues and all of that. If you do it on the LEDs and the other stuff, it becomes really spectral, very ghostly, very black. But here, in Glasshouse Deep, it was really absolutely about also exploring structural coloration that is the hallmark of the objects, which are these diatoms. They're called the jewels and the opals of the sea, So this time I went to town. I've never done color like I have in this work. Shri will tell you, like this one is the most, but it's so fascinating to me that there are these sort of, boxes in which, I mean, that's just,
They're breaking down, but you know how everything takes time, as we
Yeah.
know.
God, the mapping of, I guess, aesthetic categories onto identity categories, because you spoke very briefly, I mean, you kind of mentioned about being Indian American and the way that that kind of plays into your, well, the formative, I guess, patterns of your own making in some way. And Roy, we've talked in the past about the way that science and art, and even for you, Sandeep, kind of comes together, and the way that you're, well, from the external perspective of many people in the arts and the sciences, they want to sort of do this one-to-one mapping of your aesthetic and creative and scientific praxis onto your identities. Could you speak a bit more to that? Because that's something we've all been navigating, right?
Yeah, so I think I like to use the model of the rhizome to escape that, because it branches out and networks in ways that are indecipherable. And it takes a long time to, I mean, you can't break them down because they're constantly moving. So I think movement is really the category that I exist in, for me. And so being a diasporic subject in the United States, being a scientist, being queer, I think all of those are very sort of fluctuating identities anyway. So for me, movement is key.
I guess my question from that then is, where are your tethers for yourself? I guess.
I mean, just they're momentary. And then they move on.
Just like the diatoms in Rose's work. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that's interesting is the question has changed, but it's often similar. And I think especially if you work in the art science space, and I have been now for quite a while, then it becomes a question of what kind of art sci. There was a moment when it was very much bio art was. I mean, there are different ways in which people just basically want to make it easy to understand where you are and what that is. So it's as a little bit of what he was. Sandeep is saying, you keep moving, you keep resisting. One of the things I would actually put it the other way. I don't have an answer to that, but I'll tell you what I resist actively. I resist performing geography actively, because I have a huge problem with that. Because usually who is asking you to perform this is not someone who is interested in a really deep conversation, and it's not relevant for me. So that's something I feel is the way that I approach this. Yeah. So, because also, the whole idea, especially if we're talking about science and we're talking about science in India, and you have questions of now decolonialism, which is of course it's an important conversation. It's an important conversation to have within the context of science. But with our Prime Minister also using the same language, who is asking us to do this? Do you understand? Like which museum is asking us, or which space is asking us? So these are really, it's a tricky time. It's also a really interesting time to be operating in this space. Yeah.
I mean, there was a science and art Getty thing that happens this time, 2024. And we'd made a proposal for this collaboration between science and art. And it was so problematic because science was primary. And everything that art was doing had to be mapped onto science. It was never the other way around. And everything ended up looking like a science project. It made me ill.
Clearly. But,
Which is also why I think, again, if we come back to the spectral.
I was just
And
about
if
to
we
go
extend
there,
that into the speculative, I love that, right? Because the minute you walk deliberately the line of the speculative or the weird and the strange, you're able to you can subvert, you can use humor, you can use horror, you can use all these other tropes to critique all of these things without, as you said, walking in the lane of science or walking in the lane of, like, what does that even mean? And who gets to define what is what? You know what I mean? So I think it's good. The weirder we go, I think the better it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the weirdness doesn't have to be purely reactionary either, because I think that also is not resisting, that is a kind of succumbing in some ways, but also the way in which maybe the way that these maps work and these mappings and consolidations and this coagulation of, I guess, identity and aesthetic and practices work for many, many institutions and very colonial institutions sometimes, is a way of also making your practice real for them, of a way of making your bodies real for them, of making your practices understandable, comprehensible to them, right? And what I see in your practices and what I see in your art, in your works, is not simply a reactionary, oh, I'm going to go the opposite way or anything, right? It's just more like, let me bring you into the world of my imaginaries. see what these abstractions, see what these nuances, see what these convergences of the real and the spectral kind of feel like and look like, and could be potentially, right? Which is why spectrality has constantly been coming to me, because it is a way of almost making ghosts of yourself to some people, because they cannot comprehend you, they cannot read you, you are not legible in so many senses, and we're kind of playing within this realm of illegibility of spectrality, right?
And I think, just to add to that, the pink work especially plays with that figure ground dilemma, where from certain points of view, they just look like monochromes. And the body just appears and disappears, appears and disappears. So that idea that you can see everything from one point of view or from one place really gets shattered, and it's again moving. It moves as the viewer moves.
Yeah. I mean, this is going to be also a very free-flowing conversation. So please, ask questions at any given point of time. This very much is a conversation.
Maybe now?
Yeah. Any questions from the floor at all? Any thoughts emerging? It doesn't even have to be a question necessarily. It can just be a thought that kind of is popping out.
One thing.
Yeah.
We should all be diatoms because they're all, I'll tell you why. They are the coolest chimeric objects, right? So they're essentially plants. They're all plants. They're small microscopic plants, right? But they share a urea cycle, which is something they share with animals. So they are these weird, amazing, hybrid chimeric beasties. And they've inherited this through some kind of crazy horizontal gene transfer.
Yeah.
So we should all do horizontal transfers.
Gene transfers.
Not gene transfers, but just like
Just horizontal
knowledge
transfers.
transfers.
Yeah.
We should all. I wasn't okay.
Yes.
I just heard that again. But no, let's just go back to let's all be chimeras. Let's all be diatoms.
I'm here for it. I think someone might have a response to that. Yeah, go for it. One sec.
So on the way here, the three of us were actually speaking about our own perspectives on an artist and their art piece, and how as we view an art piece, whether we think about the artist or try to separate the artist from their artwork. So I was wondering, as an artist and as a consumer or a spectator of art, what is your relationship between associating the artist with their work versus separating the two?
Oof, like big question.
Good Lord.
I mean, I would, instead of thinking of as an artist, I would think of it more as a practice. So then it doesn't become autobiographical. It's personal, but not autobiographical in some way. You look at the arc as opposed to looking at a finite body. I don't know.
I feel like that's a loaded question because it depends how you ask it and of what you're speaking. It could be answered in a very specific way. I could read this in many different ways. So it depends really you know what I mean? Like, I feel like on one hand, you can't, or at least it's not possible to, but then you could argue that again, oh God, this is so contingent. Like,
Yeah.
I know.
I don't know how to answer this
impossible
question.
to answer it.
Unless,
22,
unless you
29, what is it?
unless you are even more specific, in which case I can be very specific, or one could be general and one could say that, it is who we are. At the end of the day, it's, your work is a deep expression of, at least for me, the way that I make sense of the world, the way that I make sense of questions I could answer it like that, or like I said, it depends entirely on how specific your question is. And I think
just like as someone who's constantly mediating, I guess, words in between artwork and artists very often. For me, conversation is absolutely key to be had with the artist, but I think I'm always very cognizant that I don't want to simply map what their life experiences are onto the artwork. I think firstly, that's a very flattened and boring reading very often, but you still have to pick up those points of piercing, of the formative points of someone's perhaps life, and then the nodes, the nodes in the rhizome, the punctum, if one will, of someone's life and narratives, and consider that. I don't think it's about not considering them. I just think it's not about, again, this sort of like very direct mapping or this direct line of communication or words that you're kind of mapping onto it. But at the same time, it's the specificity of it. Like sometimes it is very specific, know?
And
it's
I think
very difficult
intentionality goes both ways. So what is the intention in the question? Like what kind of parity are you trying to get to the bottom of? And also then are we talking about the intention of the artist within the context of a particular work? It really is it's a very tough question. So yeah. Happy to answer more if there is more specificity.
Yeah, it moves, and it's also about how the artist wants you to see their work sometimes. You know, some artists really like to foreground their their autobiography, their life, their identities, and so on, and want you to see those lenses, see their works through those lenses. And then there are some artists who absolutely don't want to do that, and most fall somewhere in between, right? So it's also about speaking to them as practitioners and asking them what it is that they see as most foregrounded in their own practice as well, I think. Yeah. Thank you. Any other thoughts, questions emerging? Yes.
So I was just looking at Rohini's work, the diatom's work. So the three of us were discussing here, neurobiologist from TFR. So we were discussing so we work on psychedelics. So during a psychedelic experience, on rodents as potential therapeutic models for anxiety, depression. So the hallucinatory experience is the sensory overload. So when I saw this work, my eyes moving all over so fast, because I think the symmetric of even the video feedback, it's giving me a sensory overload. And we find a perception of time slowing down when you're on a psychedelic. And I felt that so have other people experienced the same of time slowing down when they view your work? I mean, just as a
First
curiosity.
thing, you have made me so happy because all of that was great. No, I hope that is, I don't know. The interesting thing is this is the first time I've also seen the work installed, because I made it in the middle of the pandemic. It was shown in Busan, and I've never seen it installed either. So temporality functions differently when you're in a space, versus creating it or editing it on your own at home. For me, with all of my work, the work with video feedback, the work that is, I do a lot of work with film that is not video feedback based. It is very much about slowing down. It is very much about looking and slowing down and paying attention, if you like. And in this case, it's about paying attention to something very small. So the work, Glasshouse Deep, Glasshouse because these are plants, but these are plants of the deep. It's very much about the strangeness of the deep. It's also about how the very small assumes the scale of the planetary, So it's about, and as you mentioned, there is this kind of sense of trajectories, there are orbits, there's kind of a telescoping in and out. And even the piece, the sound is a sound that Gustav Holst, it's an album that I've been obsessed with for many, many years. He's done a symphony on the planets. So this piece, it exists in the public domain. It's Venus. And it's one of my favorite pieces. So it's one of those things, again, where I've played with it, it's reverberated, I do my own sound, right? So the sound is also playing back on itself. It's also thickened, so it's sort of, stretched in time. But yes, the short answer is yes. I hope that people get the same experience. Yeah.
I think the temporality of this work also in context is actually really intriguing, because the first time this work was shown in Busan was actually on the beach. So we projected it from like a very, very high, sort of high-res projector onto the sand. So it was kind of emerging and dying and very, very ghostly and very spectral again, but it was right in front of the sea. So when you're kind of walking through the beach, you're immersed, you can stand within the projection, right? But you're also right next to the consistent ebb and flow of the sea. So what is that non-human temporality doing with this sort of technological, artistic temporality that Rohini's work was sort of producing at the same time, right? And that sort of frictional dissonance, but then you are a very embodied spectator within that space, within the materiality of the sand, alongside this very spectral sort of light projection that's kind of coming through, right? So all of these framings of temporality were really in play with one another. But I do love the psychedelics, sort of the point that you kind of brought up, because it very much is that we were like, increase the saturation. And when you think of, trips, you're like, saturation. And that's where the sensory overload comes from. That's when you start to see patterns and fractals as well, right? Coming back to what we started with. But I mean, Sandeep, I also want to ask you about the temporality of your piece, because very often people look at non-moving image work and they're like, that doesn't have a temporality, it's static, but it's not. And we've talked so much about the narrative sort of unfolding within your pieces. The more you look at it, the more there is a movement, there is a temporality that is embedded within the work. So yeah, could you just talk more to that? Also with the songs, yeah? Yeah.
To me, I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking about this recently. For me, movement seems to be primary. And it produces the space and time, as opposed to movement existing in space and time. So I didn't know this for a long time, and I'm still trying to understand it more clearly. But I think, like you said about the slowing of time, it's the amount of information that you get in a very small period of time that makes it feel so long, because it's so rich and it's so complex. And I think that to me has always been very interesting, whether through artwork or psychedelics. So there's a temporality, not just in the figuration of the work, not just in the pictorial diagram of the work, but also in the color transitions of the work. So everything is flickering and moving and flickering and moving. And within each movement, there are more movements. And it's that movement that's really creating the experience of time and space.
So much to always mind there.
How are we doing on time? Just curious.
Oh,
So I just wanted, can I just
yeah.
go
for
free
it.
form?
Yes, please, fall.
Just so you know, there's something, because, we talked about the autobiographical. I always think about that, the personal, what is revealed, what's concealed, what is important for the viewers to know, what is not, what is just titillating and what's not. There's intentionality behind this, and I'm going to share this story with you because I think it's very formative for me. I grew up with a blind grandmother. In my entire childhood, I was just so upset that she couldn't see. I was like, how is that possible? And then as I was growing up, I was 4, 5, 6, 7, she would come and spend the summers with us. And then we would take walks and she would touch the flowers and the leaves and describe what she touched like she was seeing it. And then I would describe to her what I saw through my eyes. And I realized how expanded vision can be. It's not just limited to one kind of vision. So the idea that touch and sight come together has been a very important part of my work. It's like, I want to touch it to see it. I want to see it to touch it in a certain sense. They're just part of the same equation.
Which actually comes back to the question I had earlier, which is that, when you go up close enough, and actually you don't have to go very close to start feeling that it feels like skin. It does invite the touch also. And I think it's an important part of what you just mentioned. It's not just that you are the one who's obviously, making the work there, but it does
It
feel
evokes that from the viewer.
It feels like hide. It feels like skin. It feels like
Froth
something
also,
that was
like
shed.
there were some bits of like frothiness that you kind of, or foaminess that you kind of want to touch. And then there's all of these textures that you start to feel. So even the visual provoking, the memories of touch and the archives of touch that you might have stored somewhere in the sensorium of your brain is also kind of at play here now.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I remember the other piece that was that we showed when we did the virtual gallery show, the work that was, I forget the title, but the ones that were
Tree skins.
Yeah, exactly, tree skins. That was very similar as well, and I didn't even see it. I only saw it in a virtual space. But again, it was very. Maybe you could talk about that process a little bit.
I mean, again, because of the idea of touch, it's a physical contact, it's a physical encounter. The later work, which is more sculptural, are made through physical contact. So literally, a skin or like aluminum is placed on the subject that is being imaged, and we press into it physically to create the image. And so that's how the tree skins were made. There was a sheet of aluminum, there was my body, and there was the body of the tree. And the three of us came together. I mean, the tree and I had a mutual physical encounter, and the third skin was produced. And those are the tree skins that were then almost like a snake molting its skin. It would peel them off. And it's an image, but it's just an image of the encounter. It's not the image of the tree, really.
The traces of the encounter almost, right? Which also, you work a lot with sort of these non-human traces, these encounters between the human and the non-human, right? Which is what brought us together in the first place, because that's something that I work a lot with. How do human and non-human bodies encounter each other, ontologies encounter each other, how do we narrativize these encounters, right? And you've really been mediating this for a while, the chimeral has been part of your practice. So yeah, could you talk a bit more expansively, I guess, to your other works and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The piece I've just finished is looking at the sun, which I think is the big non-human actor in this piece, and it's based out of this amazing body of archival material that's at the Kodaikanal Solar Observatory in Tamil Nadu. And for 120 years, they have been taking images of the sun, weather permitting, since 1904. That's, yeah,
it's crazy.
It is crazy. And I went there, I do a lot of work with amateur astronomers in Delhi, and a big part of my practice is exactly this other celestial non-human, if you like. But in this case, the piece is called 100,000 Suns. It's almost complete. It's not complete yet. But we're looking at how have we recorded and observed our nearest star. Our nearest star that we literally cannot look at naked eye except during a total solar eclipse. And it is actually very much about what it means to be human, because it's very much about how we read into these objects and what that means, because it's all about projection. So it involves voices of eclipse chasers, people who've devoted their lives to standing in the shadow of the moon. It includes, archival material from Kodaikanal, like hand-drawn sunspots on discs of paper, glass photographic plates. Yeah, it's really a meditation on the sun.
Yes, I mean, everything is a manifestation of its energy, isn't it? It's quite profound, actually. It's so powerful. Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to side note, because my work plays in shadow and light, it's like a question like, why do we have, the sun is so far away, by the time the rays reach the earth, they're parallel. So we should have no shadows anytime, right? But we do. And it's because of the curvature of the earth. So it's like the idea of curvature is what's producing the shadows, the light and dark, not the sun, which is a really interesting way to think about light and dark.
There's one other amazing fact I'll just throw out there. The moon and the sun are the same apparent size in the night sky, in the sky. The moon and the sun are the same apparent size, but this has not always been the case. So this moment in geological time is 100,000 years wide, which is nothing. So if you think about it, we have the best perspective of a total solar eclipse.
Really?
Yep, Earth.
That's fascinating.
Well, it's 100,000 years, but still, it's pretty amazing if you think about it.
And it's specific to this epoch or this age?
This moment in time. The fact that I'm going to get the maths wrong, but because the moon is so many times smaller and at this distance, during a total solar eclipse, it will completely cover the sun, right? So in the past, when the moon was closer, it would have completely covered the sun. You wouldn't have seen the photosphere, the corona. In the future, because the moon is moving away from the earth, right? You will never see a total solar eclipse. It will always be an annular eclipse. It's pretty cool.
Movement. Movement.
Movement, perspective, distances, temporality, all of it's coming together.
The observer.
The observer, which is like really just comes down to when you're talking about all of the different accoutrements, the attempts to capture not just sunspots, but to even document the scientific facts, quote unquote, the data itself. At the end of the day, they are all our attempts at narrativizing all of these distances, right?
And they're a function of the measuring apparatus.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh.
You've solved the problems of the world, now you may go home.
No, but just only unraveling more problems, I think, over here.
Any questions?
Yeah.
No.
Behind you.
It's a short question, but I was looking at Glasshouse Deep and even in Sandeep's work, and I think I want to ask, it's not a question but a thought. How do you look at fiction and science fiction? And also, both your works have very precise, concrete references which seem to be empirical or personal or your thoughts. And are you using fiction or science fiction for a certain end, or do you lean towards one side or the other? I just wanted to ask.
What is the other?
Either fiction or
Science
less
fiction,
fiction.
like science or fiction.
I don't want to say reality. But aspects where you navigate with uncertainty, or when you talk about spectrality or that which we cannot know but want to see. Just
What we lose and what we recover also, I guess.
Well, I think for me, sci-fi has always been a big part of my life. Sci-fi, which I extended into speculative fiction. And I think the reason is that the question it asks is, what if? The minute you ask what if, the answers are always going to be, allow much more. And I think if you just look at an example that is unconnected to this work, but another parallel body of work that I do, I'm very interested in eco-horror, let's say, right? So if you look at Jeff Vandermeer, if anybody's watched Annihilation on Netflix, please watch it. It is a fabulous, fabulous film. The reason being that it's almost like it's the anti-Anthropocene. It's actually suggesting that what if there is no line between us and nature? How uncomfortable that would be, right? What if nature was in a constant state of camouflage? What if one, and this is a quote from his book, what if an organism didn't live in another but looked out of it? You know what I mean? It can be deeply uncomfortable, which is really an interesting space I like to inhabit with the work. The line between the uncanny, horror, wonder, those are spaces that are really interesting, because there's another fabulous historian of science, Lorraine Daston, who has done a lot of writing about wonder. And she talks, and this is something that's very close to my heart, a lot of my work, because she talks about how wonder has lost its teeth along the way. You know what I mean? It's become consigned to the side. But actually, wonder shares a history, is a very close relationship with terror, because it's an active state, right? Both terror, fear, horror, wonder force you to play the role of skeptic and believer simultaneously, right? It's that state of, am I really seeing what I'm seeing? You know what I mean? And that's where I live, basically, to answer the question.
This also reminds me a lot of something that Zizek, I just read recently, was about what are the purest emotive states that one can have, right? Fear and anxiety has been long posited as, the purest of states. You can't perform fear or anxiety, really. But I think an addition recently was also joy and enthusiasm. Mm-hmm. And that's where those two interplays of what we think of as, these very, very opposite ends of this emotive register really do in some way bring together the non-performativity of it all, the reality, the data of emotions, I guess, in some ways. But yeah.
I mean, for me, it's just a starting point. It's a point of departure for the work. And then the journey is about maximizing joyful encounters, wherever that might lead me.
Amen. Absolutely.
So much of your work also has to do with erasure and loss, right? And that's what kind of brought us into this theater of the spectral in some senses, but also of remembrance, of recovery, of traces. But also, what does it mean to actively almost like embody ghostliness or embody spectrality? Because I think we all do. I don't think it is this very defined or demarcated line between what exists and what doesn't exist, right? It is the what if. And that's what it brought me back to. It is the what if constantly being asked and constantly being performed and being exhumed in your works. And I just kind of wanted to bring it back to the question of like memory and loss and recovery and erasure for the both of you, because there's something that happens in your actual process of making some of these works, right? Mm-hmm. With layering, what is foregrounded, what is backgrounded, and even with Sandeep, your work with the erasure of it all, yes, and the traces that you can actually see when you go up close to your work. Yeah.
And just to add to that, the work that's not here, the current work, is very gravity bound. Like everything falls in the direction of time, in a sense. And so for me, the metaphor of falling is really critical for me, because that's really gravity. So I think about matter and I think about weight. One is a relationship in motion and one is a relationship in material, right? So for me, falling becomes a really beautiful metaphor for the journey that I was talking about. And it's not falling down or falling up, it's just falling.
That's great. Yeah. Any other? Yeah. This really is a conversation, not just among us. So feel free to blurt out anything.
Comments, thoughts.
Yeah.
This question is to you, Sandeep. When you work with spaces like that is portrayed in the pink medium, where does the creator, so because you had emphasized the observer, where does the observer end and the creator starts, or where does the boundaries lie?
I mean, it's a very fuzzy, goes back and forth. To me, it's like a pulsation. So I see myself, and then I see myself seeing myself. And I see myself seeing myself seeing myself. So it's an iterative process, I guess. It keeps getting bracketed out, and you can do that ad infinitum, kind of like the feedback loop. Right?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, great question for uncovering that connection. Yeah. And because, Ro, you play the role of the observer so much,
it's a great
right?
question, actually.
Yeah.
Being participant and observer both, it's super. It's a great question, yeah.
Yeah, because you work a lot with actors that are not your own body, but you are so consistently working with the corporeal or the corpus of other bodies, right? Coming into play. But they also, in some way, when you talk about not dividing the human and the non-human and us being part of nature, it seems like you're also implicating yourself within these non-humannesses, you know, that you are playing with. So even if your actual physical body is not inscribed or embedded within your work, it is still present, right? It is present both in the role of being the observer, but also, you observing yourself and your own humanness.
I mean, it's
that,
crazy.
right?
It's like when you think about the role of observation itself in quantum mechanics, everything is turned on its head, right?
Absolutely.
Because the minute you think about observation or the observer, it changes the question. So I think it is fully entangled. Absolutely. It's a great question. Yeah. It's a very...
You TIFR people. Thank you for being here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Yes. Free. Oh, Lord. Okay.
So this is for you, Ritika. I mean, we've been hearing the artists speak about their process, and I was really intrigued about your text and how you came up with that, because for those of us who didn't know, this show was, we thought about the show because it was a way to show two early paintings of Sandeep and find a new way of looking at it. And then, you know, we had not, I mean, Rohini's video was there, and it was kind of a slightly crazy idea to pair it together. We felt it would fit, but we didn't exactly know how and why. And then that's how you came into the picture. And I mean, I've been just looking at the text, also the reactions to the text from various people who've been reading it, because it really is like the third element in this show. It really is a bit like an artwork itself, you know, even the way we displayed it, and we've asked people to just take away fragments of it, whatever they want. And some people said it seems like it's AI generated, and like, so we've had all kinds of reactions to it. So could you tell us something about it?
Sounds fun. I mean, I've been called an AI on more than one occasion. Yeah, I think for me, I don't like normative or conforming curatorial practices. It's not something that I do. It's not something I'm interested in. So for me, all of this really very much emerged out of a slightly crazy cab ride in Seoul, actually, which is when we all got on a call for the first time. When you came to me with this idea, I was like, that sounds kind of crazy. I'm interested. And then we all got on a Zoom call, and we were all in different parts of the world at that point. You were in LA, you were in Delhi, I was in Seoul. And yeah, I think things just started, like, synapses just started firing, you know, and all of our brains were in these really strange, murky spaces and terrains of conversation, but something was aligning, and there were patterns that were emerging. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to do, but not exactly with the text, because I did want the text to also gesture to not just the existing sort of parallel convergences among the works, but also what was invisible in the works, and sort of bring those invisible elements and narratives and bodies together. Yeah, there was a lot happening with the text. I mean, it is a bit of a crazy situation up there, but I think for me, it's also about all of the different facets of my brain trying to make sense of all of these convergences, right? And I don't like when that leads to a monolithic narrative. I think for me, monolithic narratives are the death of thought, of critical thinking, of response, of possibility, especially when it comes to sort of curatorial texts and so on. It's very didactic, it's very moralizing. And that's something that I don't play with. It's something
religious.
that, yeah, exactly. There is this weird sanctimonious feel about it. And to treat the curatorial text as a sacred reading, you know, like the one and only reading of these works, is something that I just don't believe in for my own practice. So I just kind of wanted to leave these portals, I think, is how I thought of these vignettes. So they're not one sort of linear narrative. They are these fragments, these vignettes, these portals that people can enter through, whichever one that appeals to them, and then maybe sort of enter the world of these conversations that we've been having through that. And the reason I even use, for example, like AI to work with some of these texts is because I like to play with the non-human and the more than human as voices, but also as very, very living and extant voices that are invisible in our society, that we don't think about the ways in which they circumscribe our everyday, our political systems, you know, our cognitive, our sort of collective cognitive consciousnesses and so on, right? So to foreground like little strands of that, I think, just flickers here and there, like the synapses that were firing when we first talked. But yeah.
Because the syntax of visual art and the syntax of language are not the same. And so how can you deform the syntaxes to actually talk to each other?
It's like when you look at the word speculative and specular is to mirror. And sometimes just a mirroring is enough to make something very normal, very strange. So what I love about the text, it seems very appropriate that in fact it stranges things rather than makes clear, because I feel like the works are not simple. And neither should the conversation that brings them together.
To make it not insular, right? Because I think so many texts also try to create a world within the gallery, like within your encounters of this particular site and encountering these works. But for me, other texts, moving image, things from thousands of years ago are speaking to these works, are speaking to the impulses within these works and the narratives that are sort of emerging and dying within these artworks as well. So I did want to also bring some of that into play with it, to open it up to larger imaginaries, I guess. Yeah.
I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank you, Ritika, for doing this. No, seriously, it was not last minute, but it was a short notice. And you came to it with much grace and generosity. So we appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And lots of strangeness and wonder, which is awesome.
I will bring it. She brings it to you every ball. But yeah, super. Yeah. Any last thoughts, comments? Otherwise, I think we can begin to close. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Yeah, appreciate it.